Okay, so the meeting will be recorded, and then as the previous ones, it will be put on our YouTube channel of our faculty. So this is information for everyone that we are recording and then publishing this. Yeah, I think we can start. Although I think some people will be joining us still in those first couple of minutes. So today's meeting, the next in our series, Tyranny and Democracy, we have a guest from Basel, from the University of Basel, Professor Elodie Bayard, who is also connected to the University of Sydney. And she also is a partner investigator in the Australian Research Council project about theatre and autocracy in ancient Greece. And Professor Bayard is an author of a monograph, The Stage and the City, Non-Elite Characters in the Tragedies of Sophocles, published in Paris in 2017. And she also co-edited a volume, Theatre and Meta-Theatre Definitions, Problems, Limits, published by De Gruyter in 2021. So Professor Bayard is interested in both the ancient Greek theatre and also the problem of tyranny or autocracy or despotism, which is of interest to us in this series. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Bayard. I just want to ask everyone to make sure that your microphones and your cameras are turned off. And you can, of course, turn them on when you will be asking a question later. So, Professor Bayard, you can start your lecture.
Thank you so much for this too kind introduction. And it's not just a way of speaking. You are really too kind. I'm not a professor yet, I must say, but maybe one day. But that was too kind of you. Thank you, Mathus. So, yes, I'm very happy to be part of your stimulating lecture series, because the topic is really close to what I've been working on for the last few years. And today it will be a pleasure to explore with you the complex relationship between ancient tyrants and theatre. In recent years, I have indeed devoted much of my time to exploring more specifically how and why Roman emperors used Greek theatre in Rome and Italy. And at the same time, I was part of this big international research project based at the University of Sydney, where we have tried to explore in more depth the links between theatre and autocracy in the ancient world. So we have a co-edited volume on the subject that is currently in press, and you will get a little bit of an idea of some of the topics that we have explored in these collective volumes, as I will cite the work and contributions of some colleagues here today. I also hope that tonight will give us the opportunity in the discussion time to explore some unanswered questions that I have and that I hope you have too. There is still much work to do on ancient tyrants and theatre, and the topic may provide useful elements to better understand how today's autocrats, or would-be autocrats, use mass communication media and culture for their own interests and purposes. So let's start. It may be worthwhile at the beginning of my presentation to come back to the word tyrant. Some of the previous talks have sought to provide an exact definition of what should and what should not be encompassed under this term. So I must hasten to say, at the risk of disappointing some of you, that I will use the term tyrant very loosely here. Autocrats that might not have corresponded to the exact definition or the exact ancient definition of tyrants will be included in my survey. Actually, any leader with autocratic tendencies may be included in my discussion, be they kings, emperors, military leaders, so everything that can be put back into this loose term of tyrants. As for theater, my focus will be here on Greek theater especially, and specifically on its performative aspects, its dimensions of public spectacle rather than, for example, theater in its written form or used as private entertainment in elite circles, where it loses its dimension of mass communication medium. So if the question of the definition of Greek theater is of interest to you, you can scan here on the screen at home the QR code. It will lead you directly to the recent volume I co-edited with Silvia Milanesi on the topic, which Mateusz has mentioned in the introduction. It is fully open access, so you can access everything and read everything for free. So our first step tonight will be to survey together the history of scholarship on the topic of tyrants and theater, and to reflect on this history itself. Why has the relationship between tyrants and theater been neglected for such a long time? I will then present an overview of some cases where tyrants have used theater, from the classical Greek periods to the early Roman empire. So it will not be a comprehensive survey, otherwise we would probably still be here at least tomorrow. But I will point at some interesting examples where tyrants have used theater in different contexts and for a variety of purposes. In doing so, I will try to put more emphasis on less well-known cases instead of focusing only, for example, on Aeschylus' activities in Sicily or Euripides at the court of Archelaus. So I intentionally leave those big topics aside a little bit, and in order to provide you with some ideas and examples that you may be less familiar with. Tyrants and theaters, then. What exactly is the question? What has been done on the topic recently, and why only recently? For a long time in the history of scholarship, the relationship between ancient Greek drama and tyrants has not looked like a promising object of study. As theater was understood as closely linked to democracy, or at least to democratic contexts, the concept of autocratic theater was regarded as a paradox. Even the debate about how close indeed ancient Greek plays, and especially tragedies, were to democratic ideas, remains centered around, well, democracy as a reference point. For the classical period, much scholarly effort has gone into showing how democracy is part of theater DNA. According to such a viewpoint, democratic concepts can be found in the forms and themes of all so-called major dramatic genres, so tragedy, comedy, and satire plays. Classical drama seems to embody the democratic values of debate and popular participation. The democratic ethos could even be felt in poetic and musical styles, and democratic ideas shaped the festivals and competitions where classical theater was performed, as well as their organization, sponsorship, and the judging process used to determine the winners of dramatic contests. The physical space of the ancient theater also reflected democratic principles. And the creation of theater in its classical form, at least, is very probably to be linked to the development of early Athenian democracy. In this theoretical framework, With the notable exception of Aeschylus's activities in Sicily and Euripides in Macedon, few steps had been taken in order to explore the possible interests of tyrants in theater. And yet, Plato already mentions that tragic poets were honored especially by the tyrants and secondly by the democracies. You have the quotes here on the screen from the Republic. Why tragedy in particular seems to have drawn the interest of autocrats is a fascinating question to which I have no definitive answer. But that's one of the topics we could discuss afterwards, I hope. So indeed, autocratic regimes prominently featured in the first millennium of theater history. From classical times to the 6th century AD, autocrats were theater's greatest sponsors. They built the biggest and most magnificent theaters. They sponsored poets, actors, musicians, pantomimes later, on a grander scale than democracies had ever done. Two of the Hellenistic Actors Association were directly responsible for the cult of the local autocrat. And theater was crucial in the dissemination of imperial cults in the early or even later Roman Empire. The topic of autocratic theater, however, has only recently begun to receive the scholarly attention it deserves. Before outlining what has emerged from this recent interest in the relationship between tyrants and theater, let me take a bit of time to reflect on why it is indeed a research trend that is only a few decades old, at best, I would say. Of course, the fact that theater was understood as having direct and strong links to democracy has contributed to deterring scholars from working on the seemingly rather exotic topic of autocratic theater. But the history of scholarship in the field of ancient Greek theater studies had also been shaped by some deeper considerations. Such matters may have been only unconsciously inherited from generations after generations of scholars, but they have nonetheless dictated for a long time what research topics were worth exploring about ancient Greek theater and what was of no interest whatsoever. First of all, the almost exclusive focus on the dramatic production of classical Athens has for a long time dominated the research landscape and created a sort of vicious circle. Only classical Athenian drama is worth studying, so it is the only type of theater that is indeed studied in depth, which in turn reinforces the feeling that theater was closely, if not exclusively, linked to democracy. So, but why classical Athenian drama? The obvious answer lies in the quantity of written sources available for this place and period. It is always the same answer. With some rare fragmentary exceptions, classical Athenian plays, and even not all of them, are the only ones that are well preserved. Closely intertwined with this fact is the phenomenon of idealization that has rather early taken place for classical Athens in general, and in particular for its theatrical production. The idealization of classical Athenian culture is a vast topic, which we cannot explore in depth here, but it is important to be aware that it has also deeply shaped the research landscape for ancient Greek drama. In a way, modern scholars have inherited Cicero's attitude towards theater. Only classical Athenian drama is to be admired and studied. And therefore, no one even thought for a long time of studying tyranny's relationships with theater. Such a point of view can be tied to the more general idea of a sort of decadence or decline that is supposed to have taken place at all levels from the time of 5th century Athens onwards. Plato and Aristotle already complain about such a decline. And in fact, historical moments of decline where, for example, democracy was vacillating, began to be tied to the idea of a decline in the quality of dramatic production. The idea, again recently challenged, that Greek drama simply died at the end of the 5th or the 4th century, depending on personal preferences and idea, belongs to such a theoretical framework. And such ideas did not leave much space for a serious study of non-democratic drama until a move away from such a narrative took place in the last decades. And therefore, this exclusive focus on classical Athenian drama and its democratic context has been replaced slowly by a more globalized interest in the phenomenon of Greek theater. Two research trends have paved the way for the study of autocratic theater. The interest in theater outside Athens, finally, and the study of post-classical drama. So for the first point, already from the classical period onwards, and even in Greece itself, Greek theater was not exclusively performed in Athens. In 2017, two important books, one by your colleague Edmund Stewart and another one by Anna Lamary, have emphasized the mobility of tragic poets and the importance of an early reperformance culture. Far from being exclusively centered on Athens, tragedy, at least, was from the beginning something that was pan-Hellenic and therefore not necessarily exclusively tied to democratic contexts. More recent scholarship has also produced a number of publications on theatrical activities that were taking place at various periods beyond Greece, be it in the Black Sea region, by the 2019 book by Brown, Howell, and Wiles, or be it in Macedonia, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, in Sicily and southern Italy, or in Ptolemaic Egypt. The most comprehensive volume gathering evidence for all theatrical activities outside Athens, up to 300 BC, remains now, I think, the 2020 volume by Eric Chapo and Peter Wilson that gathers all sorts of evidence for Attica, Western Greece, Central Greece, the Aegean Islands, Asia Minor, the Black Sea area, and it's even part of Africa. So this geographical and conceptual move away from classical Athens as the center of interest for scholarship on ancient Greek drama also opened the door more widely for the study of its evolution in post-classical times. This expanded framework fostered the examination of the continuing life of Greek drama in itself and not merely of its reception. Continuity, both qualitative and quantitative, is now emphasized for post-classical theater. It has been recently demonstrated, for example, for tragedy in a collective volume edited by Vaios Liapis and Antonis Petrides. Post-classical Greek theater can be regarded as essentially similar to its classical predecessor. In spite of the expected evolution undergone by an art form that succeeded in adapting to very diverse geographical and political context, what little we know for certain about post-classical drama does not require us to see it as essentially distinct from classical drama. As a matter of fact, classical plays continued to be performed well into imperial times, and new plays in Greek language kept being composed as well. From the little we know about these new plays, they mostly followed classical models. Moving outside of classical Athens, chronologically, geographically, almost automatically implies being confronted with non-democratic contexts. The relationship between Greek drama and democracy has therefore recently been shown to be less exclusive than previously thought. Tyrants, even in the classical period, indeed found an evident interest in promoting theatre. After the classical period, autocrats followed the footsteps of earlier tyrants in promoting dramatic activities for a number of reasons that we will discuss today. And later, Roman Republican elites and subsequently Roman emperors again followed earlier models in their use of Greek theatre. Contrary to what had sometimes been argued to explain the paradox of autocratic theatre, democratic theatre and autocratic theatre are not two different beasts. The essential characteristic of Greek drama performed in democracies or in autocratic contexts are the same. The dramatic genre performed remained the same. The artists and actors themselves were clearly performing both in democratic contexts and in autocratic contexts without any marked preference. The precise context for performing drama, for example, large-scale festivals or competitions, as well as the organizational details of such events, remained remarkably stable in their essential components across time and political regimes. We are therefore left with our initial question again. Why were tyrants organizing theatrical performances? After all, even if the links between theatre and democracy are now understood to be less exclusive than we thought previously, it remains nonetheless true that intuitively, theatre feels like an art form that retains democratic undertones. And yet, already within the first 2 centuries of its existence, theatre was adopted by autocrats in Sicily, in Cyrene, in Macedon, in Thessaly, in the Black Sea area, and in Caria for the from the first half of the 4th century BC already. Eric Chapo and Peter Wilson provide in our forthcoming volume on theatre and autocracy a comprehensive survey of the autocratic use of theatre during these early stages. Why then this quick and widespread interest among autocrats in sponsoring an art form that had emerged in democratic Athens? Let's have a look at some possible answers by examining more closely a few examples. The first point that my colleagues Chapo and Wilson in their chapter have on these early phases have highlighted is the fact that it was especially tyrants at the margins of the Greek world who seemed interested in promoting and sponsoring this art form. As theatre was indeed perceived as connected to Athens, building theatre and organizing staging of dramatic plays was a way for these autocrats to strengthen their links to the perceived cultural and political center at the time, that is, Athens and mainland Greece. This wish to, in a way, get closer to Greece was not merely dictated by a wish to follow the cultural leader of the time. It was probably less cultural than political benefits that were sought by autocrats. The Hecatomnids, for example, in Caria, seem to have used theatre as a tool to display their link to the dominant political power of the time, Athens and Greece, and thus use this as a powerful symbolic way to establish themselves against and above their rival local elites. By showing through theatre, an efficient mass communication medium, that they were linked to Greece, The Hecatonids were able to draw the local population to their side, to federate them around themselves, thus depriving their rivals from local support. With Mausolus in the first half of the 4th century, the importance of theater in this strategy became very clear. Theatrical performances attracted a large local audience into the city and elicited a feeling of belonging among local population, who therefore distanced themselves from Mausolus's rivals. While we do not know much about the exact contents of what was performed, there is evidence that tragedies and possibly comedies featured on the program of those theatrical entertainments. At least a tragedy entitled Mausolus and attributed to Theodectes of Phaselis had apparently been composed. Not much is known about its content again, but it is not impossible that it may have presented the autocrat as being, for example, of divine descent, or as being the legitimate founder and ruler of Caria. More generally, theater as a marker of Greek identity could be used by tyrants in the margins of the Greek world in order to rise above their rivals and also legitimize their sole rule. By acquiring a Greek identity on the international stage, tyrants could create for themselves an important power of attraction, at least at a local level. The same kind of phenomenon seems to have been at stake in the Black Sea area or in Macedon. Once tyrants could secure a broad-based audience for their theatrical shows and a large support for their political ambitions, they also appeared as benefactors, sponsors of much appreciated entertainment. From there are only a few steps to the idea of identifying themselves with the god of theater himself, Dionysus, and many tyrants also broadcasted their privileged links to this deity. The celebration of the tyrant himself in theater was often superimposed, or at least went hand in hand with the celebration of the god, a god associated with victory and with the spreading of joy and cohesion in the social group. But it is not only by offering dramatic spectacles to a passive audience that autocrats could federate groups around them and legitimize their access to power. Theater is a participative art form, and leaders such as Alexander the Great cleverly used these elements for their own interests. So I will take here just one precise example of Alexander's lifelong engagement with theater, to show how he may have used it to safeguard his own interests. For this short summary of the relevant events, I am using mainly the works of Brigitte Le Guen on Alexander and theater, and again a chapter in our forthcoming volume, this time by Paul Toys. What I will present here is a possible reconstruction of the context of the performance of the satyr play, Aegeon. Its content is, once again, not entirely known to us, but it seems that there is a common consensus that it may have ended with a scene where a chorus of satyrs was reunited with the main character who just won against an opponent. This satyr play is likely to have been performed as Alexander was in Media, probably around the year 326 or 324 BC. It is possible that closely before the performance, a mutiny may have taken place in Alexander's army. No doubt, among other things, the soldiers blamed Alexander for his adoption of Eastern customs. They felt like he was behaving less and less like a Greek and began to feel estranged from their military leader. A likely context for the performance of this satyr play could have been a festival in Ecbatana shortly after this mutiny. Now, in such a context, the main problem for someone wanting to organize a theatrical performance would have been to find people for the chorus. In this case, a chorus of satyrs. There would probably have been no other choice for Alexander, as Le Guin has argued, than to take some of his own soldiers to create such a chorus. And through the performance, Alexander not only communicated with a passive audience of soldiers, but also made them part of the very message he wanted to broadcast. How exactly could it have worked? We could, for example, and this is very sort of tentative reconstruction. There are ideas that can be discussed. We could easily imagine that Alexander himself could have played Dionysus at the end of the Satya drama, and thus could have been reunited with his chorus of soldiers / satyrs to celebrate the victory against the bad opponent. And so the staging of a Greek Satya drama not only helped Alexander reassure his soldiers that he was indeed still linked to a Greek cultural background, since, once again, theater was used as a marker of Greek identity, but involving the soldiers directly into the performance of a play where the chorus celebrates together with the god Dionysus at the end would have worked as a powerful way to refederate the soldiers around himself after a mutiny. Before devoting our attention to the use of Greek theater by Roman emperors, let's already cross the Mediterranean very quickly and stop for a while in Sicily at the court of Hieron II. An inscription in the theater in which people gathered to attend performances during his reign will help us understand how tyrants could communicate messages through theater buildings themselves. In many cases, it was not only through the act of building a theater that the tyrants sent a powerful message, both to their own local population, but also to the wider international world. They could also, and they did, add many material elements within the theater in order to make their point very clear to everyone. It is what Hieron had done, with an inscription placed on the diazoma of his theater. This inscription is studied in detail by Chris DeLille in our forthcoming volume. But the whole point of the message is very easy to summarize here. So on the diazoma, this sort of path about the mid-height of the cavea where spectators could circulate, an inscription records several names of members of Hieron's family. So you have them here. So you can see the name of Hieron himself, his wife, Nereis, his son's wife, and very probably the name of his son himself. The other half of the inscription is occupied by names of divinities, with Zeus, Olympios corresponding in the position to Hieron himself, so both at the middle of the inscription. Frankly, the message could not be clearer, and it was displayed in full sight of all the spectators who came to find a seat to attend the performance in the theater. Hieron and his family were in direct links to the gods, and their power, both present and for future generations, was legitimized through these divine links. The theater also served as a place for political assemblies under Hieron. Maybe the tyrants wanted to give an air of democracy to these political gatherings by having them in the theater. I don't think so. I think at least it is very clear that the inscription served as a powerful reminder that no true democracy was even to be imagined at the time. And here again, using this time material culture rather than the literary content of what was performed, a tyrant uses theater to reinforce his absolute power. In the crucial space where a whole population gathered, and we know that such gathering indeed had intrinsically some potential for the germination of democratic ideas. So in this crucial space, the sole ruler reaffirmed his links to the divine, his position above everyone else, therefore legitimizing his position of power. So the use of theater by tyrants may seem paradoxical, but let's now turn to what is perhaps the most paradoxical case: the use of Greek theater by Roman emperors. Exploring why Roman emperors may have felt that it was a good idea to sponsor and promote Greek dramatic performances at a time when Greece was not the dominant power around the Mediterranean anymore, and at a time when Latin theater existed, should provide us with further insights about why tyrants used theater at all. The importance early emperors attributed to theater is easily illustrated by this map showing the number of theater buildings that existed during the first centuries of the Roman Empire, just around Rome. And if we could zoom into the map, we would see even more of those theater buildings. The numbers are really telling here. But let's have a closer look at what exactly may have been performed in terms of Greek drama. So we'll begin, of course, with Augustus. Suetonius records his interest in Greek studies, and particularly in Greek poetry. The first passage here mentions that Augustus appreciated what is called here old comedy. That is very probably what we actually now call new comedy, as Riverman has noted. So new Greek comedy. There is no real doubt that the comedy alluded to here is Greek comedy and nothing in Latin or in other languages. The context of the passage makes it very clear. What the public entertainments where Augustus had Greek comedy put on stage exactly where is not mentioned. From this passage, we can only gather that Augustus may have staged some Greek plays simply because he liked them. After all, as a tyrant, he could well stage whatever he wanted. There is, however, at least one case where it is relatively clear that Augustus may have used theater for more specifically political purposes, and it is in our second passage. That reads, he gave sometimes entertainment in all the suburbs and on many stages with actors in all languages, per omnium linguarum histriones. Here, the linguistic diversity of the performers is emphasized, and we may understand from this passage that Augustus may have used theater as a way to showcase Rome's international culture, to demonstrate that the city was now a center for cultural and artistic life. But I think that there is more to it than that. By having theater performed in all sorts of languages, and here we may imagine at least Latin, Greek, and very probably Oscan, Augustus was using theatrical activities to federate again around him the very mixed population of Rome. At a larger scale, Augustus also established In Naples, the Italica Romaia Sebasta is Olympia, a festival which included competition for Greek tragic and comic actors. And he also revived the Ludis Saeculares in 17 AD. Again, an occasion where Greek performances took place. So even in a very Roman context, Augustus introduced theatrical performances in Greek. Of course, this may have been a way to attract to Rome the best theatrical performers at the time. But beyond that, we see here theater being included in the wider landscape of festival and religious competitions, first established in the Greek world, but that had kept its importance in the early empire. Even after Greece fell under Roman domination, we interestingly see a Roman emperor using theater as a way, among other type of competitions and festival activities, I must say, as a way to make Rome part of an international cultural network where the norms and circuits established when Greece was the dominant power were still dictating what was to be done. In a way, and this may truly sound paradoxical, Augustus organized theatrical performances in festival contexts in order to be part of what was very much a Greek cultural and religious network. And I think in itself, it asks interesting questions. Claudius, too, even if indirectly, seemed to have found an interest in taking an active part in the performance of Greek theatrical events. So you have this quote here, again by Suetonius. Suetonius, who reports that Claudius put on the stage a Greek comedy at a contest in Naples in memory of his brother, Germanicus, whom he took every opportunity of honoring. And of course, this Greek comedy won the contest. Since Claudius did that in honor of his brother, it is likely that the play was the very comedy written by Germanicus himself that is mentioned in the Life of Caligula 3:2. Germanicus' writing of comedies in Greek belongs to a well-attested tradition of young members of the Roman elite who composed dramatic pieces in this language. It is very likely that more often than not, those literary essays were not followed by a real performance. But I guess there are advantages when one is the emperor's brother. Here we are faced with something a bit different from what we had seen for Augustus, I think. Despite being a public performance, its aim may have been more, let's say, personal. Why showcase his brother's ability at composing a Greek comedy? What good may have it done to the political power of the emperor? Such an event may have shown that Claudius and his family possessed Greek culture, Greek paideia. They mastered something that was reserved to an elite. Writing a Greek comedy and winning a dramatic contest with it is something that would be only dreamt of by the most educated part of the Roman elite. Such a level of mastering of Greek culture is properly exclusive. It leaves everyone else outside or below the imperial family, thus indirectly legitimizing their absolute power. I remember that last time Mirko Canevaro had shown how the tyrants tend to take actions to keep in their favor an asymmetry in the distribution of honors. Here we see a Roman emperor using art and culture to do exactly this, I think. My third and final example is Domitian, who established the Capitoline Games in Rome for the first time in 86. So you have the quotes on the screen. I just read the translation for your convenience. He also established a quinquennial contest in honor of Jupiter Capitolinus of a threefold character comprising music, riding, and gymnastics, and with considerably more prizes than are awarded nowadays. For there were competitions in prose declamation, both in Greek and in Latin, and in addition to those of the lyre players, between choruses of such players, and in the lyre alone without singing. While in the stadium there were races, even between maidens. He presided at the competitions in half boots, clad in a purple toga in the Greek fashion, and wearing upon his head a golden crown with figures of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, while by his side sat the priest of Jupiter and the college of the Flaviales, similarly dressed, except that their crowns bore his image as well. While Suetonius's mention of those games does not make it very clear that there were categories for Greek dramatic competition, evidence for contest of Greek tragedy and comedy in this context is clearly provided by a passage in Artemidorus and by an inscription. What is most interesting to remark here, I think, is that Domitian is said to preside the games clad in a toga graecanica, a Greek dress. Why, if you are a Greek emperor, would you preside cultural contests dressed in a Greek fashion? Now, I don't have enough time probably to delve into the complex and most fascinating relationships between Rome and Greece here, but we should keep in mind for our reflection that once again we find theater, and especially Greek theater, in a context where Roman emperors try to legitimize their absolute power and to present themselves as linked to a divine realm. Now, a quick synthesis on this section on Roman emperors. What were the deepest reasons for emperors to include theatrical performances in Greek language in the range of spectacles they were sponsoring and organizing in Rome and Italy? The personal taste of the emperor, of course, might have played a part in the selection of public entertainment, as well as a wish to show off their mastering of culture at a personal or family level. The simple wish to show themselves as benevolent leaders who provide entertainment for their subject may also have played a role in some cases. Providing entertainment not exclusively in Latin may also have helped federate a very multilingual population around the figure of the emperor. However, I would suggest that the establishment of wide-scale games à la grecque by Roman emperors, their reinforced links with Greek associations of scenic artists, the will to attract talented Greek performers to Rome, and the distinct increase in the number of occasions at which Greek theatrical pieces were performed during the early empire reflect a clear intention at displaying a strong Philhellenism. To convey their Philhellenism to the greatest possible number of people of all social classes in Rome and Italy and throughout the Roman Empire, where not everyone spoke Latin, of course, Greek theater was the best vehicle, the best tool Roman emperors could use. But what aspect of Greek theater made it such an attractive tool? Was it because it was linked to a certain conception of elite education among the Romans? This is most unlikely. Was it because Greek theater was still somehow felt to be linked to democracy, to freedom, or more generally to the power of the people? In other words, did Roman emperors like to organize performances of Greek theater to appear more democratic? I think this is very unlikely too. I believe that we have to look for another aspect of Greek theater. Namely, yes, it's linked to 5th century Athens, but not Athens as a democracy, classical Athens as an imperial power. As clearly demonstrated by Jean-Louis Ferrari in his various works on the topic, Roman emperor's Philhellenism and interest in Greek culture was very much linked to the idea of hegemonic power. Greek culture was felt as a requirement to acquire hegemonic imperial power, and emperors, I would suggest, used Greek theater as a tool to display to the widest possible audience that Rome possessed the necessary culture that went with their hegemonic ambitions. A remark in Strabo 922 clearly illustrates the link that was felt between Greek culture, education, and hegemonic power. The author states that as long as the Romans had to deal and carry war with, quotation marks, savage tribes, they needed no education, understood as specifically Greek paideia. But from the time they began to deal with more civilized people, they also acquire an education, and this is what allowed them to become masters of all. This is a scary quotation in many ways, but it explains a lot, I think. After this quick survey of some contexts where autocrats have used theater in the Greco-Roman world, it may be useful to give you here a short list of the reasons why ancient tyrants may have used theater and the aims they were pursuing when using an art form that intuitively may seem to be more democratic than autocratic. So why then? First of all, and most obviously, theater functioned as the mass communication medium in antiquity. Public spectacles were occasions where a large number of people from a variety of background and social statuses gathered. Theater, with the freedom it offered in the content of the play, was among one of the best ways to broadcast a message, whatever it may have been, quickly and widely. Theatrical performances also attracted non-urban population to city centers and ensured that the tyrants or autocrats of all genres had a way of communicating their message even to those less central populations. There is, of course, no need to stress that theatrical performances were among the type of entertainment most appreciated, and this for centuries. And any leader able to provide lavish dramatic performances could therefore showcase himself as benevolent toward his subjects. The religious aspects of dramatic performances and the fact that the figure of the tyrants could easily be linked to the god Dionysus, the god of theater, also worked as a powerful tool to legitimize the political power of those tyrants in the eye of the subject populations. Was there also sometimes the wish to use theater as a democratic facade? Tyrants in some cases may have played a dangerous game with this. In her latest book, Catherine Boscher alludes to the fact that in the history of Sicilian tyrants using theater, some of these theatrical activities may have led to or reinforced a wish for a more democratic regime among the population. There was thus a very fine line between a possible desire to appear democratic and use theater to do so, and ensuring that this democratic facade may not give wrong ideas to the populations subjected to the tyrant sponsoring theater. I doubt a little bit that wishing to look democratic may have ranked high on the list of reasons tyrants had to use theater. There is little direct evidence for such an idea, at least, but I will be very happy to hear what you think about that. And the comparison with the modern world may help us refine this reflection, I think. Until now, it appears as if theater was quite consistently used as a tool to legitimize the absolute power of the tyrants. Theater made the tyrants at the margins of the Greek world look like they were connected to the cultural and political center, and therefore helped them appear like more legitimate leaders than, for example, their rival members of the elite. Theater was also a powerful tool to federate populations around the figure of the tyrants, or leader, or military chief, or autocrat. And finally, theater, and perhaps especially Greek theater, was the best tool for tyrants and autocrats, including Roman emperors, to widely broadcast their mastering of culture, of education, of paideia. At times when education was felt to be an important component of the legitimation of power, one understands quite well why tyrants may have been rather keen on sponsoring the dramatic performances. To conclude, and to come back to the contemporary world now, we have seen some of the reasons why ancient tyrants may have used theater for political purposes and to help them in their quest for absolute power. What about today? Theater is certainly not the medium of choice for contemporary autocrats or would-be autocrats. If we want to start drawing a cautious, very, very cautious parallel between ancient and modern times, we should probably have a look at how modern autocrats use social media and how and why classical culture has sometimes been used or is still used. For the first point, there are here certainly resemblances as well as deep differences between how and why social media is used by people with authoritarian tendencies in the modern world and how and why ancient tyrants use theater. But both ancient theater and today's social media have a sort of democratic aura, if one can call it like that. And both can be used to manipulate the opinions of large groups of population very quickly and very efficiently. Both can also be used to federate people around a leader who is clever enough to use what looks like a democratic medium to rise himself, or maybe herself in some cases, above the others. We may keep that in mind for our discussion. As for theater as a way to broadcast one's mastering of classical culture, of an education that may have been perceived as legitimizing the idea that one is to be given more prestige and power than people who do not possess such an education, well, theater again is probably not the tool used by today's would-be autocrats for displaying their mastering of culture. But once again, a knowledge of how ancient tyrants used classical culture to legitimize their power is probably useful to reflect on some things we see today. And I look forward to thinking about that with you and to answering your questions if I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elodie. And I open the floor for discussion. So if you wanna ask a question or make a comment, use the reaction box at the top and raise your hand. Okay, so I can't see who was first. So maybe Massimo de Sanctis Mangelli, please. And then Edmund Stewart.
Yeah.
Can you turn your camera on as you're asking a question?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Oh, Okay, sorry. Yeah, there must be some problems with my connection. So thank you for this talk. These were really illuminating in many respects. I wanted to ask you the question, like, I might provide another way in which we could like analyze what Tyrants could do with theater, and I wanted like to shift the focus a little bit to the content of the plays themselves, because we know that the tyrant was actually, so not only obviously the figure in the background that provided this kind of entertainment and this kind of message, but the tyrant was, as at least in Greek theater, at least in the 5th century, Sicily, Macedon, and actually I don't know if it still keep being the case later, was actually a character in the play. And so this is absolutely interesting because obviously it was a character that, again, from what we see in 5th century plays, the Athenian canonical ones, actually doesn't come out very well, and whose fall basically constitutes the center of a lot of plays. And obviously it invites us to think about, if the tyrant kept being a character in those plays in which were sponsored by the tyrant, what use could these tyrants like, and how ideologically charged could the tyrant as a character be in plays sponsored by the tyrant, and how could they deal with the fact that the tyrant is the excesses of the tyrant are usually put under the spotlight? I know that like Duncan's answer to this question is, for example, someone like Dionysius of Syracuse wanted to show himself as a new Theseus, because we know Theseus is the atypical tyrant of Greek tragedy, in the sense the one that like always comes out positively. And at the same time, for example, here on the first in the Persians, if the Persians happen to be performed in Sicily, wanted to be seen as a Darius, of course, and not as a Xerxes. So, and in general, we could say these tyrants could have been interested in the depiction of tyrants in the play as a way, as sort of way to suggest the potentiality, but also the limitations of tyrannical power. And to link to your last, your later points on the Romans, I think it's really interesting that we know that from a didascalia to a manuscript, that Augustus paid like thousands of sesterces to this poet Varius Rufus, who Quintilian says that was like the most important tragic writer in Rome, to basically to stage this play. And probably the occasion was the after the victory at Actium in 29, to stage this play that portrayed that was called Thyestes, so the typical tyrant, and that not only the typical tyrant in being a tyrant, but that did all sort of tyrannical stuff. Like this play, the Thyestes of Varius Rufus, was performed in front of Augustus and in front of his big audience, and Augustus was pretty happy with it. And that, I think that is kind of striking, because the tyrant was a character in that play, the autocrat, and obviously the feeders of that were kind of negative. So yeah, I just wonder how you could like, if this whole, if we can like, if starting thinking about tyrants as characters in plays sponsored by tyrants could enrich our like perception of like how this might have worked.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question that really points at one of the most paradoxical aspects of autocratic theater. And that's a question that has been asked a lot, and I haven't seen a definitive answer yet, to my mind, but it shouldn't prevent us from thinking a bit further about it. So it's absolutely true that if we look at tragedy, and especially Athenian 5th century tragedies, the figure of the tyrant comes up as really a negative figure. So why, if you are a tyrant, would you actually want those kind of plays performed in front of your subjects, really? So there are a few things. First, we don't quite know whether, for example, Oedipus Tyrannus had actually been performed by a tyrant in an autocratic context. we don't have that level of knowledge, of very precise knowledge of what was performed in autocratic contexts most of the time. So one of the answers is to say, okay, so tyrants selected the plays they wanted to be performed or reperformed, or paid poets to adapt contents, or to create contents that was very different from plays where tyrants appear as negative characters. And there are solutions. I mean, there are some plays where the tyrant or the king appears like a positive character, notably in the case of Theseus, as you said. So that's the first problem. It is a bit frustrating because we know so little about the content of the plays that were actually performed that it's difficult to really provide much for an answer on this question. Another trend of reflection that has been tried is to say that actually tyrants liked those tragedies where the tyrants appear as a rather negative character. They liked them because it reminded them of all the difficulties of occupying the seat at the top, obviously. So someone who was a king or a sole ruler might have been attracted to 5th century tragedies because it reminded him of the difficulties he was in. From there to the idea of actually staging this kind of play in front of a whole population gathered in a theater, I think it's a bit, perhaps if you are a tyrant, you better just read the play and not perform it in front of a mass audience. As for the anecdote with Augustus and the Thyestes, so my colleague from Sydney, Bob Cowan, has a whole chapter on that question in the forthcoming volume, and he has some very interesting answers, including. So again, the play is not we don't know the whole text of the play, so you always have to reconstruct a bit what was in and to adapt to what you want to say about the relationship between tyrants and theater. But yeah, that's one of the big problems. Why did tyrants like tragedy? And especially for some time, I thought that autocrats and tyrants had a marked preference towards using tragedy rather than comedy. But as we have seen, there are a number of cases where it is very clear that comedy was used, comedy was performed. So I'm not so sure about that, but I would be happy to hear others on the topic.
Okay, thank you. Now, Edmund Stewart.
Thanks very much, Eddie, for a fantastic paper, and I'm hugely looking forward to your edited volume and to discussing this with you further. Just rather cheekily I thought I'd put in some suggestions of my own to the last question, which you hadn't mentioned. The first is that obviously, why do tyrants not mind plays about tyrants? Well, the tyrants don't think of themselves as tyrants. Dionysius, the first of Syracuse, was the Archon of Sicily. He was strategos autocrator. He was not a tyrant, as far as he was concerned. And I think you're right as well. It's not just that tyrants want to remind themselves of the dangers of ruling. They want to show others that they have in mind the dangers of ruling. And we can see this very much with Isocrates' orations to Nicocles and Nicocles' supposed response, where Nicocles talks about the dangers of tyranny. And he's doing that not because he's not concerned about him effectively implying that he's a tyrant. He's doing it because he's showing that he knows the pitfalls of rule. So those were the things I suggest. But actually, that wasn't really what I was wanting to say. So I'm going to swiftly move on to two comments, which I'm pleased to get your opinions on. First, and very quickly, I really liked the way that you said that post-classical tragedy showed a lot of continuity with classical tragedy. I agree entirely. I'm not sure that I think this is still a minority position, but I'm very pleased to see that you hold this view, because that shows things might be changing. The second point, comment that I wanted to make was, in some ways, I wonder. I mean, obviously, what we're interested in today is, why are tyrants interested in tragedy? But having asked you to talk on that subject, I'm almost wondering whether a more interesting question is, maybe even more interesting question, is why are oligarchs or oligarchies not interested in theatre? Because I think in some ways the democracy thing is a red herring. Because why are tyrants and democracies both interested in theatre? I think it's the same reason. I think it has to do with ergotism. It's to do with public benefaction, showing off the riches and the and of the city. And for a tyrant, the city, l'état c'est moi, it's the city is the tyrant. So I think that the two, both ironically, that the tyrant and the democracy has the same aim. But I wonder whether, when we look at oligarchies, and Sharper and Wilson, as you know, have commented on this, that they are less likely to think about theatre. And I was wondering why that is. And my initial suggestion, which I'd be pleased to have your opinion on, is that, well, oligarchies, they have no incentive to spend money on theatre, because the oligarchs are in power and they're the ones who are going to be paying for it. Whereas in a democracy, the elite clearly have an incentive because they're vying for power. And also, I think it's maybe because they don't like to have powerful elite individuals given too much showing off, because I think they're worried about the possibility that those individuals might make a bid for tyranny. And I think as well, this may explain why we have a move at the end of the 4th century with Demetrius of Phalerum away potentially from the choragic system to the agonothetes system, because I think we move from democracy to oligarchy, and it's about the state, collective, the elite collectively paying for drama rather than individuals paying for it. But that would be my sort of initial thoughts on that, and I was wondering what your opinion would be.
Thank you, Edmund, for everything. And yes, so I start with the end. I start with the end. I very much like the path you are taking to explain why oligarchies were less interested in theatre. I think that it has indeed something to do with the fear of opening doors for individuals to rise above others. That was my feeling too. I think that you are absolutely right that in democracies and in tyrannies, this is a bit less a problem. In democracies, everything is a bit under control, if you want. So it's okay to keep individuals in check, if you want, and provide theater within some rather strict rules that prevent individuals from rising too much above the others. In a tyranny, I guess the tyrant is not very much afraid of that. He uses theater for his own good. So kind of take all the individual power for himself. But I think that oligarchy is maybe very, very afraid of that kind of this potential for individuals to rise above the others through theater. So yeah, that's I would be happy to to keep going on that path. It's a very good idea. How about your comment on the continuity of post-classical theater? Well, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was not the majority, the consensus yet. But maybe we are getting there, so hopefully I agree with you on that. And what was your first idea? Yeah, this idea that the tyrants might like tragedies where tyrants are badly presented, because it allowed them to show that they were not like that. Yes, again, I think if that is the case, they were really playing on a fine line about the effects that theater could have on the audience, on the spectators. I mean, it has to do also with how much we think the audience was actually thinking about what they were consuming as spectators. How many people, let's say, in a tyranny, how much of the population who would watch a performance of Oedipus Tyrannus would think, aha, so maybe the tyrant is not that good. I think it's a dangerous game. I'm not sure if they like to play that game. I mean, it seems very dangerous to me, unless really the audience was simply absorbing the spectacle without much reflection being fostered, but by the performances. But I think there is evidence on the contrary that really theater had an effect on the audience, on what they thought, on what they might feel. And I don't know, if I was a tyrant, I would probably not like to that to be performed in my theater. But yeah, that's probably why I'm not a tyrant, you may say. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. The next question will be that of Malcolm Lowe.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, well, even try to turn on the camera. My point would be to ask, in talking about any connection between drama and democracy, I think the starting point should be what kind of role, in what way can theater serve as a means of promoting a democratic ideals or democratic procedures. And I think the obvious example is the old comedy. I mean, where Aristophanes could put Cleon on the stage and make fun of him. This is an explicit way of criticizing existing powers. However, what we find in Rome is, in fact, that what interested them was actually the new comedy. which is a kind of form of sitcoms, as you would call it today. In other words, the new comedy is not really a tool for public criticism, but rather making fun of your neighbors, which is something quite different. Now, when it comes to a tragedy, the 5th century tragedy, it was preceded, of course, by the public readings of Homer that were instituted by Pisistratus, the tyrant. And many of the themes of the 5th century tragedy were taken either from Homer or from other mythological periods in which everybody, every country was, every Greek state was in fact a kingdom. So, I mean, all of the I think all the tragedies we know of are portraying situations in a kingdom. Now, people have tried to show that in some of these tragedies there are indeed allusions to contemporary Athenian events. But these allusions have to be picked up by the audience. It's not like in the comedy where you put the contemporary rulers on. It's rather that some of the things that the people on the stage are doing reminds people of contemporary events. An obvious case, of course, being the Trojan women of Euripides. But people have tried to find the same. Now, if, on the other hand, these tragedies performed several centuries later in a different place, the illusions, that kind of illusion is lost altogether. I mean, nobody knows it anymore. So it would seem to me that tragedy is in fact not dangerous to tyrants, because actually it portrays a situation in which everyone's been ruled by kings. And even the case of Oedipus Tyrannus, he is in a sense not an evil person. He's presented rather as a very unfortunate person who, not through any serious fault of his own, ends up in a very bad way. And of course, if you take, say, Oedipus at Colonus, there he's portrayed in a very sympathetic way. So I would say that if you looked at the content of the way in which the classical Greek drama could be used to convey a political message, I would say that when performed centuries later, there was very little scope for using it. There is, of course, one famous case, that is where the Philhellene king of Persia used the head of Crassus in a performance of the Bacchae of Euripides. Of course, there's a case, you can say, where a political message was conveyed, but not against the tyrant, but rather against the Roman enemy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, there is a lot in what you say that interests me very deeply, because I've worked a lot on Sophocles, as Matthias has reminded before. There are two things. I agree with you in a good part that details of the contents of the plays are local, both chronologically and geographical allusions may be completely lost through time, and that's when a tragedy is reperformed much later in a totally different context, then the initial message of the play may be completely lost, and the play can actually carry another message altogether. I think that I like to see tragedies as providing something for everyone from the beginning. And that is very much, you can, I mean, you can read democratic ideas in a tragedy, but you can read things that would please a very hardcore elite as well. And I think that that's probably what in part make them classical literature. That is something that you can still read today and extract something you may like or you may dislike. And as such, indeed, they could very well be used by tyrants. I agree. I agree that there is no fundamental problem. The problem might rather come, as I was discussing before with Edmund, might come from the how you think the audience will react. What will they think? And it's in a way the tyrant has to bet on what the audience will think of a play if he decides to stage an Athenian tragedy where tyrants appear in a negative way, in a negative light. So yeah, my question would be that did they actually bet on that? Make that bet that it would be unharmful for them to stage such plays. I don't. Unfortunately, again, we don't. Most of the time, we don't know what was reperformed, what they were staging. So it's hard to tell. But it's the question is fascinating.
Thank you. And now Christina Bartol.
Yes, thank you very much. We still have time, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture full of inspiring thoughts. And when listening to your lecture, especially these parts of your lecture devoted to the problem of legitimizing the power and links with the divine, a passage from Aristotle Politics came to my mind. As far as I remember, Aristotle said that it is necessary for a tyrant to constantly show concern for religious matters, ta pros tus theos, for the subjects conspire against him less in the belief that even the gods are on his side. And my question is a very short question. What do you think? If this phrase, ta pros tus theos, could be understood not only as offerings, but also as a sponsoring theater. If so, we can treat this quite early testimony of Aristotle that this religious aspect is very important, and sponsoring by the tyrant theater should be proof of his eusebia, or what is even more important, it is a means of preventing himself from being accused of asebia. What do you think about it?
Thank you very much. It is indeed a brilliant idea and a brilliant quote you extract here. Thank you very much. I think this is very relevant to some of what we have seen. It gives a bit of a different angle to this question of tyrants using theater as a way of legitimizing their power. But I think you are right in your idea that it's not only by showcasing themselves as being linked to Dionysus, for example, or as being linked to the divine realm through theater. It's not only that tyrants put themselves above the others. Perhaps I have understated this a little bit, and you remind us that there is something further. It's not only that you are above the other, but if you are linked to the gods, then people who are against you are basically impious, and that would make the whole idea of using the religious aspects of theater much more powerful. So yeah, I like that. This is an interesting path to to keep going on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I allow myself to make a comment because, first of all, with regards to your exchange with Edmund, what came to my mind was an example of an oligarchy which was very not only fond of theater but obsessed with theater, namely the Republic of Venice in the 17th century and the Venetian opera. So Monteverdi, Cavalli, and of course the political motives were focused on how bad tyrants are. Like in Coronazione di Poppa by Monteverdi, Nero is depicted as a villain, but at the same time he wins at the end, and everyone is happy with the lieto fine. So this is a very very mixed bag. But for the Republic of Venice, it was a part of the Roman ideology because Venice considered itself to be the successor of the Roman Empire. But well, I mean, the point is that theater can be used by anyone. It can be used by democracy, by oligarchy, by tyrants. And my comment / question would be, isn't it? Don't you think it's because, as you showed in your lecture, the content, like the verbal content, the ideas, it's only a part of the theatrical performance. There may be music, there may be the visual experience, which allows anyone to shift the focus to different aspects. So, for instance, if people have fun because of the performance, because of music, they may not even notice political allusions, for instance, right? So, and examples again, which could be interesting is there is a film by a Georgian director, Tengiz Abuadze. It's called Repentance. It was awarded in the Festival of Cannes. It depicted a tyrant. It was an allusion to Joseph Stalin. But in this movie, it was in the 80s. In this movie, the tyrant likes music and opera very much, and Stalin himself was also styling himself as the protector of culture. And the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, which for some people is the symbol of freedom and all the revolutionary ideas, liberal ideas. In this movie, it's the favorite piece of music of this horrible tyrant, which shows that it doesn't really matter what is the content. And from another side, it's also the hymn of the European Union, which is interesting because in the text itself, there is the sentence, über dem Sternenzelt muss ein lieber Vater wohnen. That is, there must be the loving Father in heavens. But the European Union, of course, is openly cutting itself from the Christian and religious tradition. So it shows that you can use theater or performance in general for various reasons. And so I think what you showed is that we are maybe too much focused on the verbal channel. So what do you think of that?
Yes, thank you so much. This is a very stimulating idea and comment, and I very much like your point that we focus probably too much on the content. This is one of the other reasons why Tyrants in Theater is a topic that has been left aside for a long time, because we most of the time don't have the content of those plays, of the plays that were performed under Tyrants. And so if we don't have the texts, it's not worth studying. and this is a very, I mean, I'm happy that we are a bit away from those kind of points of view now, and that we can indeed see theater as what it was, that is a performative art form. And your point about the importance of the music, of the context, the celebrations, the religious aspects, could all be used in various ways by various people, and could all be perceived by various audiences or various parts of the same audience very differently. For example, one of the simplest question is, did everyone in an audience of a reperformance of a Greek play in Rome understand really word for word what was said? And yeah, it's not certain at all, and very often probably didn't matter. And there is a strong argument that can be made through exploring how pantomime was used by Roman emperors. Pantomime that is very much still a theatrical type of entertainment, but where words play really a tiny role. Music, dance, move, costumes were much more important than the verbal content, which we have entirely lost. So it's almost the proof of what you are saying, if you want. And those pantomime performances were very much used by Roman emperors to disseminate the cult of the imperial cult, and yeah, there is still the verbal content is much less important than everything else that was going around. And again, perhaps it has a bit to do with this idea of simply showing off culture, showing off education. And that's important too. And it can be used for good and for bad aims, I would say. It's probably just important to keep an eye open on the process and on who is using what for what goals. If studying the past can help us become more informed audiences of the present, that would be nice.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the lecture, the stimulating paper, presentation, and I thank everyone for an interesting discussion. Yes, and I hope we see, at least some of us, we'll see each other at the next event in May. I will send out the information. So thank you again, Elodie Payam.
Thank you, Mateusz, Edmund, and everyone. Bye.
Everyone. Bye-bye.